Welcome everyone to the breakout session on an appreciation of the slime growing in your favorite lakes or streams, all about algae. A couple of housekeeping items first as we're getting started. If you have questions for our speaker, you can enter them into the chat. I will be your moderator for this afternoon's session, and I'll keep an eye on those questions for our speaker, and we'll address them to her when we have a chance at the end. Be sure to keep yourself muted so noises from your computer don't interrupt our speaker or distract her. We appreciate that. We also are, of course, recording this session, just like all of them. So if you are torn between which sessions you wanted to go to, or you want to go back and revisit a session, we're recording all of these. And in a few days, they'll all be available on the MiCorps website with links to our YouTube channel. We're also going to be sending out an evaluation of the conference to all of you who registered in a few days after the event. We're really interested in your feedback on all of our sessions during the conference and any suggestions that you have for us for future conferences and trainings that we offer. And so we're really excited to have this session offered today. I'm excited to introduce Dr. Julianne Heinlein. She is an aquatic ecologist and algal taxonomist with the Great Lakes Environmental Center in Traverse City. The majority of her work entails analytical, logistical, and taxonomic support for federal and state agencies. And she has been an algae expert and devotee for over 25 years. And I can attest to that because I've been outside with Julie more than once, and I rarely see her without her hand lens, ready to collect some algae and identify it and tell everybody else.
You're looking at plants, yeah.
While I'm looking at plants, right? So between the two of us, we either excite or bore everyone around us. So I'm really excited to have you here. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Joe. I appreciate the invitation. As Joe mentioned, my name is Julianne, and I am with the Great Lakes Environmental Center. I'm an aquatic ecologist, but my background and my love is for the algae. And a couple of things before I get started, I just want to mention I'm having a little bit of an allergy issue, so I may need to take some sips of water. Two, I do have a tendency to speak quickly. If it happens to be too quickly, I am perfectly fine if someone says something. And the last thing is that this presentation is really a lot of show and tell. So it's full of images, and they are from multiple places, and they are not credited in here. So just know that they are just for educational purposes only. So the first big question, which most people don't really know, is what are algae? And even algal people who study algae argue about this. But they are what we call an unnatural grouping. And what that means is that the organisms, the specimens that are placed in this group are not closely evolutionarily or may not be closely evolutionarily related. In fact, some of the groups are in completely different kingdoms or even higher differences, higher level differences. But it is an ecologically meaningful collection of organisms in that, number one, they're all capable of photosynthesis, although some of them have stopped using photosynthesis and have gone on to other ways of making fuel. They all have chlorophyll A. They are mostly aquatic, although there are terrestrial forms as well, but those terrestrial forms need water to survive. And even the ones that look a lot like plants, which we'll talk about and you've probably seen, they have no true vascular tissue like plants do. And what that means is that there's no specialized cell areas to transport water or sugars through their body. So you can see these are all algal forms, from giant kelp up in the upper right-hand corner here to these tiny little blue-green balls right here. And I could spend the whole time just showing you photos of beautiful algae and the different types, but that's not just what we're here for. So what I'm going to do is let a little bit of a slideshow play while I get into some of the background slides. We'll see how this works. So just some interesting facts about the evolution. Blue-green algae or cyanobacteria evolved about 3.5 million years ago. And we owe them our lives. Most life on Earth owes blue-green algae this praise, because about 2.5 billion years ago, they are the organisms that put all of the oxygen into our atmosphere, that allowed all of the oxygen using organisms to evolve. Green algae evolved around 900 million years ago, and diatoms, which are an interesting group we'll just talk a little bit about later, about 136 million years ago. And so these are an ancient group of organisms, and they are very, very diverse, and very, very important ecologically and evolutionarily. Just to show you get into some of the bigger differences. The size range is many orders of magnitude. So a lot of algae consists of only one cell, one microscopic cell, while the largest have millions and millions of cells. So up here, we see this tiny blue-green cell, cyanobacteria cell, and here we have the giant kelp forest. Those are both considered algae. And the complexity, as is apparent, again, from the photos, the complexity range is huge as well. From these prokaryotes, which means cells that don't have any internal structured organelles or anything like that. Their nuclear material is just all around the cell. So they're very simple. To plant-like chara or muskgrass and these giant kelps. And there's a whole range of specialization that goes along with these as well. And so many different morphologies or appearance of these things. But the basic forms are single-celled, colonial, like this guy up here. This is a green alga called pediastrum. And each of these cells could live on its own, but it lives in this colony, and it's always shaped like this. Filamentous, like the spirogyra right here. Each one of these is a filamentous strand made up of multiple cells of that alga. And then we have muskgrass or chara here. That's very plant-like. And they are everywhere. Algae are everywhere, like bacteria are. Obviously, they're in lakes and streams, in the oceans, wetlands, but you also find them in the desert. You find them on soils. In fact, in Michigan, you can find some blue-green and green algae that may be growing in your lawn at certain times of the year. I'll show you some pictures of that. But it grows on tree bark. They're part of lichens. They grow in rainforest canopies and even snow, as you can see up here. And we will see this algal snow in Michigan at times, and in your bird bath. I'm sure some of you have seen this happen. If not the red algae, then the greens. And then you can see the thermal hot pool up there. So they grow in all kinds of extremes. So let's talk about the good first, because we always, especially with lake monitoring and stream monitoring, it's always about the bad of algae. But algae are of huge importance in ecosystems and in evolution, as I mentioned. And primarily because, not only because, but primarily because they're photosynthesizers. And as most of you know, as many of you know, that means they turn energy from the sun into sugars that then fuels life, their own life, and then the life of others around them. And so they feed the oceans and the lakes and the rivers and even some terrestrial ecosystems. They're the base of the food web for many, many complex systems. And then secondarily, through this photosynthesis, they're oxygen producers. So the cyanobacteria 25 million years ago produced the oxygen in our atmosphere that created what we needed for life like ours to evolve. But even now, algae produce greater than 40%, around 50% of Earth's oxygen in the atmosphere. So we still owe our much of our capabilities, our ability to breathe on algae, which a lot of people don't know. Rainforests are great, but just diatoms, which are one particular type of algae, produce about 40% of Earth's oxygen. They are also habitat for other organisms. There's just a little example here. This is a filamentous green alga here, and on top of that are diatoms growing, another form of algae, and some smaller forms. And it's not just other algae that grow on top of them. They are homes for protozoans and invertebrates, and even some, larval vertebrates like larval fish. Because they're photosynthesizers, they are important for the nutrient cycles. They remove nutrients from the water column and the sediment, use them as their building blocks. Some of them even make atmospheric nitrogen available for other organisms like plants to use. Most people don't realize this, but plants and a lot of other algae cannot use nitrogen from the atmosphere, even though it's so prevalent. It has to be in a specific form. And some blue-green algae fix nitrogen to make it available. They're also a big part of carbon sequestration. They can be carbon sinks, especially in the oceans, where the phytoplankton grows and takes up carbon dioxide. And then a lot of those cells settle to the bottom of the ocean, and they're there for thousands of years, and that carbon goes with it and sinks. Just to touch on a few things about their economics and social importance, just because it's fun. Algae is in a lot of food we eat. A lot of you, especially with the rise of sushi, you eat algae and you openly eat algae, but algae is in everything from ice cream to cosmetics to laxatives to a lot of things that are smooth in consistency use algae derivatives. They're also used for biofuels and in forensics. I'll talk a little bit about that later, or I can talk more if you're interested. And then some more technical things I'm not all that up to date on, but some nanotechnologies based on algal structure, particularly diatoms. So next time you're eating ice cream, think about the fact that you could be eating a little bit of algae that's helping you have a really smooth and enjoyable time. Now let's talk about the stuff we'll see in Michigan or when you're out in the lakes and rivers. There are three main groups that you will most often notice with the naked eye. I mean, there are all different types of algae out there in Michigan and our different habitats, but they're not, they're not visible to most of us. So diatoms, which are that group of algae that I told you about that have these cool glass cell walls, as you can see here, are a huge part of providing food for ecosystems because they produce a lot of yummy and healthy lipids and for consumption. Cyanobacteria or blue-green algae is the other large group that we can see with the naked eye. And then green algae, like this kadafra here. So when you're looking into rivers and streams and you're thinking about algae and other forms growing in the waters in your habitats, we talk about benthic and benthic algae and planktic algae or planktonic algae. And benthic just means, and you might know this, benthic just means living on the bottom in the simplest terms. So one of the primary things you're going to see in Michigan lakes and streams around here is benthic cladophora. And chances are that's in, at least in small quantities, in just about every lake that isn't, doesn't have an extreme pH or is a little more acidic or difficult. But this is what cladophora looks like under the microscope. And you can see it can take on different forms depending on the habitat it's growing in. So it can do these long, stringy structures or body type, or it can do this kind of tough, like heavily branched. And this is the stuff, a lot of people think about cladophora, not only do they see it, but if you've heard of it, it's probably because it does create a lot of nuisance growths, particularly in streams, but in some highly nutrient heavy lakes as well. Another bottom or benthic green alga or algae that you'll see is something that we call in the algae community, at least some of us call frogspit. And if you look at this picture right here, you can see why I refer to it that way. And you can see it looks a little bit different than the cladophora. When you feel it, it's a lot slimier. And it tends to feel a little less structured than the cladophora does. And these groups, these slime balls, tend to be made up of several different genera. These are some of the common ones. This is Spirogyra. This is something called Zygnema. Up here we have Edagonium, and they tend to be bright green like this and fluffy. And chances are that if you're not kayaking or boating and looking at the bottom of lakes, you're going to see these after they're starting to die off and they get a lot of air bubbles trapped in the mats, and then they float to the top. And they form like a surface. Some people would call them a surface scum, and that can certainly create problems, at least aesthetically. Diatoms, you usually see there's diatoms in the phytoplankton, which means they're in the water column, but they generally don't grow to enough mass that you'd see them with the naked eye. Usually when you see diatoms, when you're out in these habitats, you're going to see them as mats on rocks or sand or silt. These are diatom mats, and these are some examples of what diatoms, live diatoms, look like under the microscope. And in order to identify these guys, just as kind of a side note, we actually have to clean out all of the cytoplasm in there. So we get rid of these chloroplasts and the nucleus and all the other matter in there. And just look at the ornamentation of their cell walls. That's how we tell them apart at the species level. At least, we're starting to use DNA now as well. We see benthic cyanobacteria or blue-green algae. A lot of people don't realize that. They think about the blue-green algae in the water column, but there's a lot of blue-green algae that lives on the sediments in lakes and streams as well. This is a filamentous alga here. These two are, this is a nostoc, which they tend to grow in these clumps or these balls. Sometimes they form these crazy like ear-like structures, or even huge masses. And this is kind of a general idea of what those crazy masses look like under the microscope. And then these are microscopic views of some standard blue-green, filamentous blue-greens. There's a lot of planktonic cyanobacteria. You are most likely not going to notice that until they form blooms, which I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with. Some of these blooms are hazardous, some are not. There were a lot of Gliotrichia blooms. That's these really, I call them koosh balls because that's the shape they have. And this is what they look like in the water column. To me, especially when I'm looking down in the water, it looks a little bit like looking at a starry sky. And generally they're harmless if they can get, if they get to high enough levels. This is pretty dense here, sample. They can cause skin irritation, but woolly turkey blooms are not uncommon in waters in Michigan. These guys you're probably familiar with. This is a microcystis bloom, and this is microcystis on under the microscope, some basic forms. And these, of course, are the primary components of hazardous algal blooms. And then here are a few others that form hazardous algal blooms. This is a Phantasman. It makes interesting because of the way these are each separate filaments here, but they all kind of aggregate in these strange clumps. And because of that, they have this interesting texture when they bloom. So usually you can tell in a Phantasman bloom just by looking at it macroscopically. These guys, much harder to tell. A lot of them look very similar. But this particular bloom is a mix of this, which is a species of Anabina, and this called Planktolyngia, which is a filamentous. They're both filamentous. So you can see these are each individual cells and they're all strung together like beads. And here it's hard to see, but here's one cell, here's another cell, and just these long filaments of cells. And you would not see these until they bloom, until they get to a high enough mass that they're evident. Cara or muskgrass or skunkweed, there's some other names for it, is another one you're going to see in a lot of lakes in Michigan. There are similar genera or similar groups like Nitella and Nidolopsis, which is an invasive, but mostly, not always, but mostly you're going to see some kind of species of Cara. And these are those that are very confusing because they look like plants. When you see these growing on the bottom of a lake and you touch them, it's not uncommon to think of them as a plant. Why wouldn't you? They're anchored to the bottom. They have complex structure. They even look like they have leaves. They don't have true leaves. They don't have true roots, but they have some of the same functions. They've evolved to do some of the same things. And muskgrass is interesting too because it lives in calcareous sediments, and so it often collects calcium carbonate or lime in its cells. So when you pick up Cara, most of the species, it's going to be very obvious. You're going to feel it. They're going to be a little crusty, a little hard, crunchy. This is Vaucheria. I'm just going to quickly through it because I'm taking a lot of time here. Or waterfelt. You might go your whole time without seeing these guys, but then you might run across a stream where this is the main component. And it looks a lot like some of the blue-green mats. They're very similar, but if you pick it up and you feel it, it feels like felt, why they call it water felt, or cat hair. They also call it the cat hair alga. A few things that are not algae that confuse people, and understandably, this is duckweed and water meal. So this whole section here is filled with duckweed and watermeal. There's algae in there, but this is not an algal bloom. Here's a close-up, so you can see some of the primary duckweeds in here. This is a larger duckweed, and then these tiny little guys are watermeal. And if you pick them up in your fingers, they feel like a meal, like a grain. They're very granular. These are also not algae, and these are things that many people don't know about. This right here, and I'm sure that Joe will be happy to tell you more about it, but this is a freshwater bryozoan, and we've seen a lot more of those recently, so people have been getting calls about them. And up in this upper left corner here is what they look like microscopically. It's a colony of microscopic filter feeders. And they grow in these big masses and often in ball form. This is Ophidium. There's been a lot of Ophidium blooms lately too, and you'll see them, a lot of times you won't see them until they're floating or they drop to the bottom in shallow areas. But they're green because they are little, it's a colony of these protozoans, and inside those protozoans is algae growing, symbionts. And then the last thing I'll mention, once again, quickly, these are freshwater sponges. Bet you didn't know, well, okay, you guys probably know. Most people don't know that that we have sponges, freshwater sponges around. And when you look closely at these things, you can kind of see some of the structure to them that you wouldn't see in the algae. So kind of quickly, what affects algal growth? Well, you can think of algae are photosynthesizers, and you can think about them in terms of how plants grow, what plants need to grow. And when you're feeding plants, the nutrients they need are primarily phosphorus and nitrogen in large amounts. There are other trace nutrients, same kind of things that are in your plant fertilizers. And in most of the waters in Michigan, not all, and not all the time, but they're primarily limited by phosphorus. So when phosphorus comes into a system, that algae is ready and primed to just start growing. And phosphorus causes a lot of our nuisance and hazardous algal growths. Light, of course, just like with plants, you need light for photosynthesis. Some algae, like diatoms, are really good at low light production. They're not great at high light. So blue-green algae or cyanobacteria can make it in really high light situations. And that gives them, that's one of the things that make them really good competitors in the middle of summer. Temperature ranges affect what algae grows and how much it grows, and also water quality. So different types of algae are sensitive to different things. So conductivity, or the amount of solutes in a particular water body, will affect what can grow there. And there are other factors like grazing. So snails eat algae, little protozoans eat algae, larval fish. Grazing can be a big factor depending on the lake or other habitat that you're in. So these are the primary things that shape what grows where and how much grows in a particular area. And like I mentioned, different algae respond to different things. So thinking of all of this, it's important to remember that algae, sometimes even in large amounts, are a natural and desirable part of freshwater bodies, particularly in small or older lakes. And it's not unusual to see seasonal blooms. So not all clumps of algae are bad. Not all blooms are bad. It depends on the extent and what the bloom is. So now let's talk about, we talked about the good. Let's talk about the bad and the ugly. This is an algal bloom in Lake Erie. As you know, some of the worst, usually microcystis blooms. And so just some basics on what hazardous algal bloom is, or HABs, as you'll hear them called, or you probably have. In the situations in our inland lakes and streams in Michigan, they're primarily cyanobacteria that are causing these hazardous algal blooms. If you get to some marshes and marine systems, there are other groups of algae. But when we talk about HABs in our systems, it's primarily blue-green algae or cyanobacteria. And the toxins that they produce are usually hepatotoxins, which are liver toxins, or neurotoxins, which affect your nervous system. And they're dangerous, as you know, because they can actually kill organisms. Fish are greatly affected, birds, aquatic mammals, or even livestock that are drinking out of these bloom-containing ponds or rivers can die if they ingest too much. And with climate change and these increasing numbers of algal blooms, are also seeing a lot of canine deaths. So that's something you always want to think about. And if you're unsure about a bloom, just be cautious, err on the side of caution, and don't let your, let alone, don't let your kids, or yourself in there, but also don't let your dog in there. One thing that most people don't know is that not all cyanobacteria that cause blooms are toxic. So there can be cyanobacteria that are forming these huge blooms that are not forming toxins. And the toxicity level of any bloom varies depending on environmental factors. And it's very complicated, and there's a lot of research going on trying to predict what causes, a certain toxic blue-green to produce large amounts of toxins as opposed to lower levels. Here are just some pictures of what you'll see. These blue-green blooms often look like pea soup if they're mixed through the water column or spilled paint. On closer inspection, if you pick some up and look at it, you can usually see the smaller individual colonies. So it won't look like a paint film or spilled paint once you pick it up and look at it. And they tend to be this either bright green or dark green, but they can also be, many different colors. And I have to admit that Joe put me on to this next test, and I'm a little wary of it. It's this, just because you should never use these as a definite test. These are quick tests to try to determine if you should further think about what's happening in your lake. So the jar test is one that can help you identify whether your plankton bloom or bloom that's in the water column is primarily blue greens, or if it's something like a green or another group of algae. So if you take a sample, mix it up, make sure it's mixed well, and then let it sit overnight. Refrigerate it. You should refrigerate it. Most of these toxin-bearing blue-greens are very, very buoyant because they produce these air bubbles, or these they're called vacuoles in their cells that allow them to rise up and then float on top of the surface. And so on the right is a bloom primarily composed of blue-green algae. And on the left here, in the middle here, is what is probably a green. So that's a quick test for you there. There's another one that helps you differentiate blue-green algae blooms from like mostly filamentous greens, and that's the stick test. If you stick a stick into the water and pull it up, does it dissipate off of the stick, or are you pulling up long filaments of stringy clumps of goop? If you're pulling up this long stringy goop, it is most likely a blue-green. It's most likely a filamentous green alga. Now, there is one hazardous filamentous blue-green. It's called Lingbia. That you might come across. It's going to look very different than this, however, and it's rare that you'll come across it, especially floating up like this. So those are kind of quick and dirty tests to try to decide if you've got an algal bloom, a blue-green algal bloom. So those are hazardous algal blooms. The other way that an overabundance of algae can cause problems are these nuisance growths, and that's excessive growth of non-toxic algae. So they're not going to kill you, they're not going to make you sick from toxins that they produce themselves, but they create secondary problems. So they deplete oxygen in the water. You may have heard about this, but when you have a large algal bloom, the algae are producing oxygen, but when that algae bloom dies off and all that biomass starts to be decomposed by bacteria and other organisms, those organisms use oxygen. And the dissolved oxygen in the water can plummet down to nothing. And that's what creates the dead zones in the the Gulf of Mexico and in Lake Erie often. So those fish kills that happen are due to low oxygen, not due, they're different than, you know, than the die-offs, than some of the other kills in other marine systems. They can also affect how drinking water tastes and smells. They can clog intake pipes or fishing gear, biofoul your boats. As you can see for here, especially with these and types of filamentous algae and this diatom growth, they can really shift, they can alter habitat. So it's going to change the way that other organisms, fish and invertebrates, bugs, interact with their habitat. But primarily, in a lot of the stuff that we personally would see in this group, most of it is a problem with aesthetics. It's gross when it all piles up and it starts to die. They're slimy and they're smelly and they're full of bacteria because it's all decomposing. So these are some pictures of cladophora blooms in rivers. Once again, this is what cladophora looks like under the scope, but you can see here it has a lot of structure. It's very filamentous, especially in streams. Other times it can form tufts, but it can form tremendous amounts of mats, and just covering stream beds and lake beds. Michigan, Saginaw Bay, and Huron and Saginaw Bay often has cladophora overgrowths, which close beaches. There are some parts of Lake Michigan that have this, Lake Erie, of course. And these are being affected by zebra mussels as well. So when zebra mussels come into a system, as you probably know, they filter feed and they take out a bunch of the plankton and phytoplankton that were in these systems. And so they make the lake water clearer. So light gets down a lot deeper than it used to. And what that does is it brings more light to more bottom of a lake. And as they draw this phytoplankton down, they're also drawing down and they're taking these nutrients, you know, all these components that make up the algal cells, they're taking them down to the bottom, and then they deposit them as feces on the bottom, and that moves a lot of the nutrients from the water column to the bottom. So we see an increase of cladophora with zebra mussels as well. Here's some more. I'm going to speed up a little bit here. These are other filamentous greens. I'm sure you'll see these a lot, especially in little ponds and in bays of the lakes that you're on. These are not cladophora. It looks like kadafra, but when you pick it up, they're a little bit slimier and have less structure. This is a diatom bloom. I'm going to skip over this. If anybody's interested, we can talk about it later. Because I just wanted to touch quickly on what's causing these blooms in general. And that's primarily nutrient loading. So as we talked about, these algae in our areas are mostly phosphorus limited, sometimes nitrogen limited. And runoff from fertilizers used in residential areas and in farming areas move into these systems, and they have this algae just waiting for that available phosphorus. And runoff has been increasing because there's more built up areas, so there's less land for the water to sink into before it runs off into a surface water body. There's more fertilizer usage. And we have a lot of lack of buffer zones. So I put in a couple of nice photos here of people who built in some native buffer zones on their lake property. If you have grass going all the way down to your shoreline and into the water, that increases the chance that you're going to have runoff and be causing some fertilization issues, particularly if you're fertilizing your lawn. Sewer overflow and septic leakage can also cause problems. And certainly in some areas that might be the issue. Most often what you're having is surface water runoff that's bringing these nutrients in. And they're increasing for a number of reasons, but primarily because of climate change. And this, what I'm going to say here is a very simplified version. There's a lot of complexity involved, but generally climate change is increasing water temperature, which increases, causes higher metabolism. So algae grows faster. Warm waters also, and if anybody's interested, I can talk about this later or after, favor cyanobacteria. And so you see the shift has these hazardous algal types just because they're better at dealing with warm water. And also, when you have warmer water, you tend to have these stagnant areas of the water column because the water's not moving, it's forming layers. And then the other really important piece of the puzzle is this change in rainfall patterns. So we're seeing less frequent but harder rains. And this leads to a much greater runoff going over the surface and not sinking in, water not sinking into the ground as it rains. And this is causing, it seems to be one of the primary factors in increasing blooms in Lake Erie and many inland waters. And I think I ran over, so we'll just have to stop there. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Heinlein. That was an amazing kind of exploration of the algae that we find in Michigan waters. And we do have a couple of minutes for questions, and we did have some come in. So I'm going to use this time as best I can to get through those.
Okay.
So the first one is Gomphonema and gross jelly, an issue in Michigan rivers or lakes.
Gomphonema and gross jelly. Are you so? I'm going to go up to this milosphenia, which is not what you're talking about, but the problem is related to it. And so Gomphonema and closely related species or a closely related genus, Cymbella, form these stalks, these mucilage stalks. And they tend to form more stalks in lower nutrient waters. So it's the opposite of these other nuisance algal blooms. And so I'm not familiar with the Gomphonema issues you're talking about, but certainly I have seen some Cymbella overgrowths forming these, these mucilage tufts. We do have some Didymosphenia in upper Michigan. It may have just been found in the Manistee River yesterday or the day before yesterday. But you're probably not seeing Didymosphenia. What you're probably seeing is a Cymbella. And if you're interested in learning about those, I can, you can talk to me off. I'm Great. Not sure if that answered your question or not.
Maybe we'll ask you to, well, we don't have to, you're registered, so they'll be able to find your contact information
absolutely.
On the registration list.
Yeah, email me.
Yeah, and another question that came in, what magnification do you need in a hand lens to see some of the structure of different kinds of algae?
Most of the blue-green algae you're not going to see in the standard hand lenses. There are some really nice little field microscopes that are getting a lot less expensive that will allow you to see a considerable amount of the structure. So when you're dealing with the microscopic blue-greens and even with the filamentous greens, it's going to be difficult to see at the cellular level with a hand lens. But it can amplify some, a lot of other things. Cara, Vaucheria, you might be able to see some of the chloroplasts even.
Nice.
It never hurts to have a hand lens, I guess, is what I'm saying. But as far as seeing cell structure of the microorganisms, it'll be tough to do that.
Got it. All right, one more question for you. Would diatoms look like a brown rusty growth on the bottom of a lake?
Yep.
All right, easy one.
Yeah, they sure could. And we're seeing more of that lately in lakes that didn't have that before. And so people are starting to freak out a little bit about it. Diatom growths are, it may be different, but it's usually not anything to worry about. But if you're having what you think is a nuisance growth, that's something to talk to lake monitoring groups about.
All right, thank you so much. We're at 3:30. I know there was a couple questions in the chat we didn't quite get to. If you want to move over to the Ask Us Anything session we're going into now, you can bring up those questions there, folks. But again, thank you so much, Julie, for joining us and sharing your love and knowledge about algae of Michigan's lakes and streams.
It was a lot. I know it was a lot. I was trying to encompass, some of the general stuff. So I hope it was.
It was great. It was really great. Thanks again.